The date was January 18th, 1991. The night sky over the Saudi Arabian peninsula was not black. It was a bruised, suffocating purple, lit from below by the sodium glare of distant cities and the sudden violent flashes of anti-aircraft fire. For the Iraqi missile crews concealed in the vast, empty expanse of the western desert, the darkness was their only armor. They were operating on the razor's edge of survival. The air was thick with the chemical stench of kerosene and inhibited red-fuming nitric acid, the volatile propellants that fueled their primary weapon. They were hunting, but they were also the hunted. Above them, the invisible eyes of the coalition air forces were sweeping the dunes, looking for the heat bloom of an engine ignition. But the orders from Baghdad were absolute. The logic of the war had shifted from the battlefield to the psychological. If the coalition forces could not be stopped on the ground, they had to be broken in the cities. The weapon of choice was the Al-Hussein, a locally modified variant of the Soviet R-17 Elbrus, known to the world by its NATO reporting name, the Scud. To the Soviet technical advisors watching from the shadows of intelligence outposts in Moscow and Baghdad, this was the ultimate test of a doctrine that had stood for 40 years. The ballistic missile was the sword that could not be parried. Since the dawn of the V-2 rocket in the 1940s, the strategic assumption of warfare was simple. Once a ballistic missile is launched, there is no defense. It rises into the stratosphere, it arcs over the curvature of the Earth, and it falls at hypersonic speeds. It is a bullet fired by a giant. You cannot catch a bullet. You can only hide or hope it misses. The crew in the desert received their coordinates. The target was Dhahran, a city teeming with American personnel, logistical hubs, and the terrifying momentum of a military buildup. The launch sequence was a frantic ballet of practiced terror. The heavy MAZ 543 transporter erector launcher groaned as the hydraulic rams pushed the missile upright. The gyro stabilizers spun up with a high-pitched whine. The countdown was not a calm recitation of numbers, but a hurried shout against the roar of the desert wind. Ignition. The night was torn apart. A blinding pillar of fire erupted from the base of the missile, turning the sand into glass. The Al-Hussein roared into the sky, riding a column of flame that was visible for miles. For the crew on the ground, the immediate danger was now the American airstrike that would inevitably follow this heat signature. They scrambled to collapse the launcher and flee. But for the strategists, the focus shifted to the radar screens. The missile climbed. It punched through the troposphere, shedding its boosters, a lone, unstoppable object hurtling towards the edge of space. It reached its apogee, miles above the Earth, and began its terminal descent. Gravity took hold. The warhead, carrying hundreds of kilograms of high explosives, accelerated to Mach 4, then Mach 5. At this speed, the air in front of the nose cone turned into plasma. It was moving faster than the speed of sound, faster than any rifle bullet. In the Soviet military doctrine, this was the death zone. Nothing existed that could intercept an object moving this fast, at this steep of an angle. It was physics. It was a mathematical certainty. The target was minutes away. The radar operators in Baghdad watched the blip descending towards Dhahran. They waited for the confirmation of impact. They waited for the seismic report, the news flash, the chaos. But then, the telemetry did something impossible. On the screens, the falling star was not alone. From the ground near the target city, something else had launched. It wasn't a panicked spray of anti-aircraft gunfire, which would be useless against a target falling from the stratosphere. It was a distinct, solid radar return, a streak of fire rising up to meet the falling death. To the Soviet analysts monitoring the data, this looked like a glitch, a sensor error. Perhaps the Al-Hussein was breaking up under the aerodynamic stress of re-entry, a known flaw in the Iraqi modifications. The missile was notoriously unstable. Yes, that had to be it. The warhead was disintegrating on its own. But the data told a different story. The second object, the anomaly rising from the city, was accelerating. It was maneuvering. It was climbing a vertical wall of air, turning directly into the path of the hypersonic intruder. The two blips on the radar merged. A split second later, the sky over Dhahran didn't light up with the ground-shaking impact of a Scud hitting a barracks. It lit up thousands of feet in the air. A blossoming flower of orange and white fire. A detonation in the high atmosphere. The Al-Hussein was gone. It hadn't malfunctioned. It hadn't missed. It had been erased. The debris rained down harmlessly into the desert outskirts. The city remained dark, intact, and silent. In the Iraqi command bunkers, There was a moment of stunned silence. The report came in from forward observers. The target was not hit. The weapon was destroyed in the air. The ranking officers stared at each other. This phrase, destroyed in the air, did not make sense in the context of ballistic missile warfare. You can shoot down a slow-moving bomber. You can, with luck, shoot down a cruise missile. But you cannot shoot down a ballistic missile in its terminal phase. It defies the laws of engagement established since 1945. Before we dive deeper into this technological anomaly that shattered the Soviet worldview, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden mechanics of history and the Cold War, make sure you are subscribed to Cold War Impact. We analyze the events that shaped our modern world. The confusion in the bunker was absolute. Was it a lucky shot? A fluke? Maybe the Americans had fired a wall of flak so dense the missile flew into it? They ordered a second launch. 2 nights later, the scenario repeated. The launch, the arc, the descent. The terrifying speed of the Soviet-designed weapon plunging towards its target. And again, the impossible response. A streak of light rising from the ground, a computerized precision that seemed almost alien in its reaction time, and then obliteration. The reports reaching Moscow were beginning to cause a deep, vibrating panic within the halls of the GRU and the designers at the Fakal Design Bureau. The Soviet Union had built its entire strategic defense and offense around the concept of the ballistic missile. Their nuclear deterrent, their theater warfare doctrine, their intimidation tactics, all of it relied on the assumption that while the West might have better planes or better computers, they had no shield against the rocket. If the Americans had found a way to hit a bullet with another bullet, the balance of power hadn't just shifted, it had evaporated. The advisors in Baghdad frantically reviewed the radar tapes. They slowed down the footage. They saw the incoming Scud, moving at nearly 2 kilometers per second. And they saw the interceptor. It didn't just fly into the path, it adjusted. It calculated. It hunted. It is a ghost, one Iraqi colonel reportedly muttered, staring at the screen where his weapon had simply ceased to exist. They are shooting ghosts at us. The stakes were suddenly existential. This wasn't just about the Gulf War anymore. If the Americans could protect a city from a Scud, could they protect a silo from an ICBM? If the Soviet nuclear arsenal was suddenly rendered obsolete, then the Soviet Union was no longer a superpower. It was just a large, bankrupt nation with a lot of useless metal. The mystery of the glowing streak over Dhahran became the single most terrifying variable in the Cold War's final act. The Soviets needed to know what it was, how it worked, and most importantly, if it was real or a terrifying illusion. Because if it was real, the Cold War was already over, and they had lost. The silence inside the main intelligence directorate in Moscow, the GRU, was heavy, composed of cigarette smoke and the rustle of classified thermal paper. It was the morning of January 21st, 1991. The reports from the Middle East were no longer fragmented teletypes from field operatives. They were a deluge of data that defied the established physics of Soviet military engineering. General officers gathered around illuminated map tables, staring at the trajectory plots faxed via secure lines from their advisors embedded deep within the Iraqi military infrastructure. The mood was not one of anger, but of a profound, unsettling intellectual crisis. They were looking at the impossible. In the Soviet doctrine of air defense, there was a rigid hierarchy of threats. At the bottom were subsonic cruise missiles and propeller aircraft. Above them were supersonic jets. At the very top, untouchable and supreme, was the ballistic missile. The Soviets had spent billions of rubles developing their own interceptors, systems like the S-300 anti-aircraft systems, which were formidable against planes. But stopping a tactical ballistic missile in its terminal dive? That was a theoretical capability, something reserved for the drawing boards of the mid-1990s or the year 2000. Yet, the data from Dhahran and Riyadh was unambiguous. The target was acquired at an altitude of 20 kilometers, one analyst recited, his voice devoid of emotion. Closing speed estimated at Mach 7. Intercept occurred at an altitude of 6 kilometers. Total engagement time, 9 seconds. The room was quiet. 9 seconds. In 9 seconds, a human operator could barely spill his coffee, let alone detect a hypersonic threat, calculate a firing solution, arm a missile, and guide it to a collision point that was moving faster than a rifle bullet. "It is a computer," a senior ballistics expert muttered, tapping the glass of the table. "It has to be fully automated. No human hand touched that switch." This was the first terrified realization. The Americans had removed the man from the loop. The investigation began with a frantic scramble to categorize the ghost. The Soviets needed to know if this was a new, singular wonder weapon, or if the Americans had fundamentally changed the nature of the battlefield. The GRU tasked their listening stations in the region to focus entirely on the electromagnetic spectrum. They needed to hear the voice of this weapon. Traditional radars of the era, including the best Soviet models, operated with a mechanical sweep, a dish spinning on an axis, painting the sky every few seconds. This meant there was a lag. You saw the target, then the dish spun away, and when it came back 3 seconds later, the target had moved 2 miles. But the signals the Soviet electronic warfare officers picked up from the American batteries were different. They were not a rhythmic ping, ping, ping. They were a continuous, screaming flood of microwave energy. It was a sound that didn't breathe. "It is staring," one electronic warfare officer reported. "The radar does not spin, it stares." This was the first clue, and it led to a deepening paranoia. If the radar wasn't spinning, it was a phased array system, thousands of tiny computer-controlled transmitters steering the beam electronically. The Soviets understood the theory. They used it on massive, building-sized radars for ICBM early warning. But to shrink that technology down? To put a supercomputer and a phased array radar on a trailer that could be towed by a truck? It suggested a level of microprocessing power that the Soviet Union, with its lagging computer industry, simply did not possess. As the days passed and the Scud hunt continued in the desert, the Soviet investigation turned to the wreckage. They needed physical proof. Intelligence assets on the ground were ordered to scour the impact zones in the desert outskirts, looking for fragments of the American interceptor. They found twisted metal, scorched electronics, and graphite veins. But the pieces didn't fit the puzzle of traditional missiles. The fins were too small for aerodynamic steering at low speeds. The motor casing suggested a burn time that was incredibly short and violent. This led to the wrong conclusions, a series of theories that circulated through the Kremlin and the bunkers of Baghdad, each more desperate than the last. One prevailing theory was the laser deflection hypothesis. Some Soviet physicists argued that the Americans weren't hitting the missiles with other missiles at all. They speculated that the streak of fire, seen rising from the ground, was a disguise, a pyrotechnic display to hide the use of a ground-based laser or a directed energy weapon developed under the Strategic Defense Initiative, the infamous Star Wars program. They argued that kinetic impact was mathematically impossible at those angles. Therefore, the Americans must be heating the skin of the Scud until it structurally failed. It was a terrifying thought. If the Americans had operational lasers, the entire Soviet nuclear arsenal was scrap metal. Another theory was electronic hijacking. The Scud missile, specifically the Al-Hussein variant, was a crude instrument. It used simple gyroscopes for guidance. Some analysts believed the American weapon was projecting a massive electromagnetic pulse, frying the guidance circuits of the Scud and causing it to tumble. The explosion in the sky, they argued, was the Scud's self-destruct mechanism triggering due to a guidance failure, not an intercept. This theory was comforting. It meant the Americans were just clever tricksters, not masters of physics. It meant the Soviet missiles were still mechanically sound, just vulnerable to jamming. But the reports from the pilots flying over the region shattered the jamming theory. Iraqi pilots and even commercial observers noted the visual clarity of the events. They saw the interceptor rise. They saw the smoke trail. They saw the distinct, sharp turn, a maneuver pulling 30 Gs, a force that would turn a human pilot into jelly, and they saw the flash of the proximity fuse. It was kinetic. It was brute force applied with surgical precision. The bogeyman began to take shape in the minds of the enemy commanders. The weapon was given a mythical status. Iraqi crews, previously confident in their shoot-and-scoot tactics, began to feel a crushing futility. What was the point of risking execution by British SAS commandos or American airstrikes to set up a launcher if the missile you fired would simply be swatted out of the sky like a slow fly? The psychological impact was devastating. The Al-Hussein was their terror weapon. It was designed to bring the war to the enemy's cities, to cause panic and force political concessions. But now, the television screens in Baghdad and Moscow showed the impossible. American reporters standing on hotel balconies in Riyadh and Dhahran and Tel Aviv, wearing gas masks but filming the sky. They weren't cowering in bunkers. They were watching the fireworks. The Americans had turned the ultimate offensive weapon into a spectator sport. In Moscow, a grim realization set in. The investigation had failed to find a flaw in the American system. They hadn't found a trick. They hadn't found a weakness. Instead, they had found a mirror that showed them their own technological obsolescence. The Soviet generals looked at their own massive stockpiles of R-17 missiles, thousands of them. They looked at their war plans for a hypothetical invasion of West Germany, plans that relied on a massive opening barrage of tactical missiles to suppress NATO airfields. If this ghost system could stop a Scud in the desert, it could stop the opening salvo of World War III. The investigation concluded with a chilling report to the Central Committee. The text was dry, technical, and horrifying. It essentially stated, "The American system tracks multiple targets simultaneously. It prioritizes threats automatically. It engages without hesitation. We do not have a countermeasure." They knew what it was doing, but they still couldn't understand how a small, trailer-mounted box could outthink a supersonic missile. They needed to look inside the box. They needed to understand the mind of the machine. While the Soviets spiraled into paranoia and theory across the ocean, in a nondescript industrial park in the United States, the architects of this miracle were watching the same news feeds. But they weren't confused. They were holding their breath, watching 20 years of secret labor face its first true test. The Soviets were hunting for magic, but the truth was something far more practical and far more American. While the Soviet generals in Moscow were chasing ghosts and debating laser physics, the answer to the mystery was sitting in a snowy, nondescript industrial park in Andover, Massachusetts. It was not a weapon born from a sudden, frantic, wartime innovation. It was the product of a slow, methodical, and incredibly expensive evolution that had begun nearly 2 decades earlier inside the laboratories of the Raytheon Company. The project was known as the MIM-104 Patriot. To the casual observer, the Patriot system did not look like the future of warfare. It didn't have the sleek, menacing lines of a stealth bomber or the brute size of an aircraft carrier. It looked like a collection of beige shipping containers on wheels. The heart of the system, the thing that was currently baffling the best minds of the GRU, was the AN divided by MPQ-53 radar set. In the 1970s and 80s, Soviet radar design followed a specific, logical path. If you wanted to see further, you built a bigger dish. If you wanted to see faster, you spun the dish faster. It was mechanical engineering pushed to its limit. The American engineers at Raytheon, however, had abandoned the spinning dish entirely. They built a flat, grey face tilted towards the sky. It looked like a billboard. It had no moving parts. It didn't spin. It didn't nod. It simply sat there, immobile. This was the phased array. Instead of a single beam swept mechanically across the sky, the Patriot's face was covered in over 5,000 tiny, distinct elements, each capable of transmitting a pulse of microwave energy. A central computer, a marvel of 1980s processing power, could trigger these elements individually, with time delays measured in nanoseconds. By manipulating the timing of these pulses, the computer could steer the radar beam electronically. It could look left, right, up, or down instantly, without moving the trailer a single inch. This was the secret the Soviets couldn't see from their satellite photos. The Patriot radar wasn't just a flashlight in the dark, it was 5,000 searchlights controlled by a single brain. It could scan the entire horizon for new targets, while simultaneously locking onto a specific incoming threat. It could track 100 targets at once and guide 9 missiles to intercept them, all while searching for more. It was the first weapon of the Cold War that was defined not by its explosives, but by its software. But the true genius, the impossible capability that stunned the Iraqi missile crews, lay in a concept called track via missile, or TVM. In traditional Soviet systems, the ground radar did all the work, shouting instructions to a dumb missile. Or, the missile had its own expensive radar in the nose, making it heavy and complex. The Patriot split the difference. The missile itself had a passive seeker, an eye that could see but not speak. As the Patriot missile flew towards the incoming Scud, it watched the reflection of the ground radar bouncing off the target. It sent this data back down to the massive computer on the ground. The ground computer, which had the processing power of a mainframe, crunched the numbers, calculated the perfect intercept path, and sent the commands back up to the missile. The missile was a puppet. The ground station was the master. This meant the missile could be lighter, faster, and incredibly agile. It didn't need a heavy brain on board. It just needed muscle. However, there was a catch. A massive, terrifying catch that the engineers knew all too well. The Patriot was designed to shoot down aircraft. Planes are fast, but they are not ballistic missiles. Planes fly horizontally, they have wings, they maneuver. A Scud missile falls from space at Mach 5. It is a rock dropped from the heavens. When Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in August 1990, the Patriot was not technically certified as an anti-ballistic missile system. It was an anti-aircraft system with a theoretical software patch. The engineers at Raytheon and the US Army had been working on a software upgrade known as PAC-2. This update changed the mathematical algorithms in the computer's brain. It told the radar, "Don't just look for things flying across the horizon, look for things falling from the stratosphere." It also changed the fuse. To kill a plane, you just need to explode near it. Shrapnel will tear through the aluminum wings, destroy the engines, or kill the pilot. But a Scud missile is a solid steel tube falling at hypersonic speed. If you explode near it, the shrapnel might just bounce off. Or worse, you might blow the tail off, but the heavy warhead, the bomb itself, would keep falling on the exact same trajectory, hitting the city anyway. The PAC-2 upgrade tweaked the proximity fuse. It forced the Patriot missile to fly slightly ahead of the incoming Scud and detonate just as it passed. The goal was to drive heavy fragments of steel directly into the warhead's nose cone, detonating the explosive in the air or shattering the guidance vanes so the missile would tumble off course and break apart from aerodynamic stress. It was a software patch for physics. In late 1990, as the coalition forces built up in the desert, the pressure on the Patriot crews was immense. They were deploying a system to do a job it had never done in combat, against a threat that was terrifyingly real. The crews, young American soldiers, sat inside the engagement control station, the ECS. It was a van packed with screens and buttons. Inside, the atmosphere was less like a trench and more like the bridge of a starship. They weren't looking through binoculars. They were staring at green monochrome symbols on a CRT monitor. The man-in-the-loop concept was critical here. The computer could do it all, automatically detect, track, fire, but the American doctrine required a human decision. A human hand had to turn the key to auto. A human eye had to confirm the track. But against a Scud, the human reaction time was too slow. The engineers had to trust the code. They had to trust that the millions of lines of Fortran programming would identify the specific radar signature of a Scud missile amidst the clutter of birds, clouds, and friendly aircraft, and authorize a launch before the human operator could even blink. This was the ingenuity that the Soviets had missed. They were obsessed with the hardware, the size of the rocket, the yield of the warhead. The Americans had realized that the hardware didn't matter if the software was smarter. When the first Scuds launched in January 1991, the Patriot batteries were operating on the bleeding edge of technology. The radar beams swept the sky, managed by algorithms that calculated the curvature of the Earth and the speed of light. The intercept over Dhahran wasn't magic, it was math. The American solution was to build a shield made of data. They had created a bubble where the laws of probability were skewed in their favor. The ghost that the Soviets feared was simply a machine that could think faster than they could. But as the war progressed, the initial euphoria of the Scudbusters would face a dark and controversial reality check. The technology was revolutionary, but it wasn't perfect. And the shock that was coming wasn't just about the success of the Patriot, it was about the horrifying realization of what happened when the math was off by even a fraction of a second. The Soviets were about to learn that even a failed American system was more dangerous than their successful ones. And the world was about to see the true face of missile warfare, where a hit didn't always mean safety. The ghost finally stepped out of the shadows and into the living rooms of the world, not through a classified briefing in the Kremlin, but through the lens of a television camera. The date was January 22nd, 1991. The location was Tel Aviv, Israel. Until this moment, the Soviet High Command had been piecing together the puzzle through intercepted radar signals and fragmented reports from the Iraqi desert. They had theories, they had fears, but they lacked the visceral, undeniable proof of what the American system could actually do in a saturation environment. Saddam Hussein, frustrated by the failure of single missile launches, ordered a barrage. If one arrow could be caught, surely a volley would get through. It was the fundamental Soviet logic of war. Quantity has a quality all its own. In Moscow, the generals watched the live feed from CNN. This was the first war in history to be broadcast in real time. The grainy, green-tinted night vision footage showed the skyline of Tel Aviv. The sirens wailed. Then, the sky began to streak with light. From the east, the heavy, burning arcs of the Al-Hussein missiles appeared, descending towards the dense urban center. They were carrying their full payload of high explosives. Then the ground erupted. It wasn't just one or two interceptors this time. It was a salvo. The Patriot batteries stationed around the city unleashed a swarm of missiles. The television screen became a chaotic web of smoke trails and rocket exhaust. For the Soviet observers, this was the moment the shock truly landed. It wasn't just that the Americans were shooting back, it was the behavior of the missiles. On the screen, they watched a Patriot missile climb, turn, and then in a move that defied all previous understanding of guidance limitations, dive downward to chase a Scud that was trying to slip under the radar horizon. "Look at the energy management," a Soviet air defense specialist reportedly whispered in a Moscow briefing room. The Patriot didn't just fly a predicted path. It adjusted, it corrected. It dogged the incoming warhead like a wolf chasing a deer. Then came the explosions, one after another, flashes of white light in the sky, high above the rooftops. The debris rained down, but the massive city-leveling detonations of the warheads were absent. The camera zoomed in on the smoke trails dissipating in the wind. The reporter, breathless, announced that the attack had been neutralized. The silence in the Soviet Ministry of Defense was absolute. They were not looking at a lucky shot, they were looking at the death of their export industry. The Soviet Union had supplied half the world with R-17 missiles, promising them the ultimate stick to beat their neighbors with. In 10 minutes of live television, the Americans had turned that stick into a toothpick. The reveal was horrifyingly simple. The Americans had solved the math of the terminal phase. The Soviet reaction was immediate and desperate. They contacted their liaisons in Baghdad. The advice they gave was a mixture of panic and futile ingenuity. They couldn't upgrade the Scuds, the technology gap was too wide to bridge in days. They couldn't jam the radar, the phased array was too frequency agile to be blinded by the crude Iraqi jammers. So, they suggested a change in tactics that bordered on the suicidal. They advised the Iraqis to modify the welding on the fuel tanks. The theory was that if the missile was structurally weaker, it might oscillate or corkscrew during re-entry, making it an erratic target that the Patriot's computer couldn't predict. It was a desperate gamble. The Iraqi engineers, working with crude tools, extended the fuel tanks of the Scuds to give them more range, but the welds were poor. When these Frankenstein missiles were launched, they didn't just corkscrew, they began to break up. As the Al-Hussein hit the atmosphere, the drag ripped the missile apart. The warhead would separate from the body, and the fuel tank would disintegrate into a cloud of tumbling metal. For a brief moment, this confused the Patriot. The radar suddenly saw not one target, but 5 or 6. The computer had to decide which piece of falling junk is the bomb. The Soviet analysts watching the telemetry felt a surge of hope. The Patriot radar was painting the fuel tank, wasting a missile on a piece of scrap metal while the warhead fell silently alongside it. But then, the American software adapted again. The sheer speed of the Patriot system's reaction loop meant it could fire multiple interceptors, targeting the largest pieces of debris. Or, the operators would switch to ripple fire mode, launching 2 missiles for every one incoming track. The Soviet countermeasure, relying on their own shoddy manufacturing to confuse the enemy, was a humiliation. They were relying on failure to achieve success. The realization went deeper than just the missiles. The Soviet Air Force looked at their MiG-25 and MiG-29 aircraft. These planes were designed to fly fast and high, to outrun threats. The MiG-25 Foxbat could reach Mach 3. It was the pride of the Soviet aerospace industry. But watching the Patriot interceptor target moving at Mach 5, the Soviet pilots realized their speed was no longer a shield. If that battery could hit a Scud, a MiG-25 was an easy target. The entire doctrine of speed is life had been deleted. The shock was total. The Americans hadn't just built a better shield, they had rendered the Soviet sword obsolete. Moscow ordered a review of their own S-300 systems. On paper, the S-300 was equal to, or perhaps even better than, the Patriot. It was a formidable beast, but on paper no longer mattered. The world had seen the American system work in the chaos of real war. The S-300 was a theoretical giant, the Patriot was a proven gladiator. As the smoke cleared over Tel Aviv and Riyadh, the diplomatic cables began to fly. Nations that were considering buying Soviet military hardware suddenly went silent. India, China, the Arab states, they all saw what happened. Why buy a Soviet missile that the Americans can swat away? Why buy a Soviet jet that can't outrun an American computer? The psychological victory was complete. The Americans had taken the most terrifying, unstoppable force of the 20th century, the ballistic missile, and turned it into a manageable problem. But as the war ended and the dust settled, the analysts would find one final, crushing statistic that would seal the legacy of this event. It wasn't just about the intercepts, it was about the numbers. And when the accountants of war finally tallied the score, the result would expose the true depth of the Soviet collapse. The war in the desert ended as abruptly as it had begun. The smoke from the burning oil wells drifted across the Persian Gulf, and the coalition forces declared victory. But in the quiet briefing rooms of the Pentagon and the Kremlin, the real accounting was just beginning. The verdict on the Patriot missile was complex, controversial, but strategically absolute. In the immediate aftermath, the numbers presented to the world were staggering. Initial army reports claimed a near-perfect success rate. 41 out of 42 Scuds engaged were destroyed, the headlines screamed. Later, years of forensic analysis and congressional hearings would lower those numbers significantly, revealing that often the Patriot had hit the Scud's body but missed the warhead, or that the falling debris had caused damage regardless. The bullet hitting a bullet was harder than it looked, and the technology was still in its infancy. But for the Soviet Union, these post-war corrections did not matter. The damage was already done. The killer statistic that truly mattered wasn't the percentage of warheads destroyed. It was the strategic score, 0. Saddam Hussein had fired 88 Scuds at Israel and Saudi Arabia. His goal was to drag Israel into the war, fracture the Arab coalition, and turn a military conflict into a holy war. He needed the Scuds to provoke a massive, uncontrollable response. He failed. The Patriot batteries provided enough political cover and enough physical protection to keep the coalition intact. The terror weapon had been neutralized not just by explosives, but by the perception of safety. The American shield had held the alliance together. This failure reverberated through the Soviet economy like a shockwave. The Soviet Union was in its final, gasping months of existence. Their economy was crumbling, their shelves were empty, and their political system was fracturing. The one thing they still had, the one thing that gave them a seat at the table of superpowers, was the perception of military parity. They were the other titan. The Gulf War, and specifically the duel between the Scud and the Patriot, shattered that illusion forever. It exposed a fundamental divergence in philosophy. The Soviet military machine was built on the principles of the Second World War: heavy industry, massive steel castings, and overwhelming volume. It was an analog giant. The American machine, as revealed in the desert, was built on the principles of the future: microchips, software code, and precision. It was a digital predator. The Soviets realized they couldn't just build their way out of this problem. They couldn't just weld more steel onto a tank or pour more fuel into a rocket. To catch up to the Patriot, they would need a Silicon Valley. They would need an open economy capable of producing advanced microprocessors. They would need the very things their ideology forbade. The ghost that had baffled them wasn't just a radar signal, it was the ghost of their own obsolescence staring back at them. This technological disparity destroyed the global market for Soviet arms. In the 1980s, the USSR earned billions exporting weapons. In the 1990s, that income stream evaporated. Why buy a T-72 tank when you saw them popping their turrets like champagne corks? Why buy a Scud when the Americans could type a few lines of code and knock it out of the sky? The financial collapse of the Soviet military-industrial complex accelerated the collapse of the Soviet Union itself. The empire didn't end with a bang, but with a realization that they were bringing a knife to a laser fight. Today, the Patriot system is still in service, upgraded and evolved, watching the skies over Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. The impossible intercept is now standard operating procedure. But if you look back at those nights in January 1991, you can see the exact moment the history of the world pivoted. For 40 years, the Cold War was defined by the threat of the offensive: the bomber, the missile, the inevitable strike. The logic was mutually assured destruction. There was no defense, only revenge. But when that first streak of fire rose from the sands of Dhahran and met the falling star in the upper atmosphere, the equation changed. The shield became as powerful as the sword. The Soviets watched the sky light up, and in that flash of high-altitude fire, they saw the writing on the wall. The era of brute force was over. The era of the smart weapon had begun, and in that new era, there was only one superpower left standing. The mystery was solved, the ghost was real, and it was wearing an American flag.